Welcome into the Buckeye 20 show. I'm Dan Hope, joined by Chase Brown as we continue to recap a spectacular national championship season for the 2024 Ohio State football team. We've joined you here a couple other times over the course of a year to rank the top 20 players on Ohio State football team. We're going to do it one final time for the 2024 season, the season that just concluded with a national championship a couple weeks ago, looking at the 20 players who were the best over the course of the entire season to lead the Buckeyes to a national title. And Chase, I don't know about you, but I know for me, filling out this ballot was the hardest one of the entire year because there were so many guys that I felt like I was putting too low on my ballot because there were so many guys who were so great in that college football playoff run that I think there were a ton of players that I wanted to rank higher in these final rankings than I did at any other point in the year because of how good they were in those final four games.
Yeah, absolutely. Spoiler alert, Josh Simmons is in the top 20. And I realized today when Dan and I were talking about it that I didn't even have Josh Simmons in my top 20, and he's going to be a first round pick. That's how hard it was to choose guys on this Buckeye 20 list because as I was going down the order, we're going through guys who contributed to this national title run. And he's someone, for example, that didn't even come to mind because I haven't seen him play since the Oregon game in the regular season. And so there's plenty of guys like that. So many people contributed to this national championship. So yeah, I'm right there with you in terms of it was really hard to put together this list and get guys that you knew could order or stack themselves out in a way where each of them were ranked appropriately.
We'll put this graphic up here on the screen so that you can get a snapshot of these rankings before we go through them one by one. But when we just look at the overall rankings as a whole, I think there's two things that stand out to me. One is that 15 of these 20 players are going to be in the NFL next year. There are a lot of seniors on this team. You also had guys like Josh Simmons, Quinshon Judkins, who had another year of eligibility but decided to go to the NFL. And so I think the first thing that stands out when I look at this list is, man, Ohio State's going to have a lot of talent to replace next year because 15 of these guys are going to be gone, including 15 of the top 18 guys on this list, 12 of the top 14. So Ohio State has a lot of really good players from this national championship team walking out that door, which is to be expected. You win a national championship with a very experienced team. You've got to do some rebuilding the next year. But the two guys in that top 14 that Ohio State doesn't have to replace are the guys who are number one and number two on the list, those being Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs. So while Ohio State has a lot of key players to replace this upcoming season, and the next time we do this, whenever that might be in the spring, this list as a whole, number 3 through 20, is going to look a lot different than this list does. Number 1 and 2 are still going to look the same. And that's certainly an exciting thing for Ohio State fans is that they get to watch one more year of Caleb Downs and 2 more years of Jeremiah Smith.
Right. And they're on both sides of the ball, too, which I think is important as well. You have something to look for or somebody that is at least familiar on both sides of the ball. And both guys are game wreckers. Jeremiah Smith coming in, Dan, as we talk about that list being full of guys who will be in the NFL next year, for Jeremiah Smith to be the number one player on this list at 18 years old for most of the season and maybe playing a couple of weeks there where he was 19, he's still a freshman. He comes in, he's the best player on this roster. It speaks volumes of who he is. I know there's already been a lot of websites, a lot of outlets who are predicting that he'll be right there in the Heisman conversation next season. Caleb Downs may even get some looks in that conversation as well. But it's an exciting thing when you're talking about the perspective entering next year to know that this roster, for all the turnover, those two guys at the top are going to be somebody you can look for each week.
It truly is remarkable that a team with this many fantastic senior players, a team that is probably going to at least tie the record for the most NFL draft picks in April, that its best player was a freshman. But you and I both agreed on our ballots. Out of the 9 voters on our staff who participated in this balloting all year long, 5 of us had Jeremiah Smith at the top of our lists. And there's a few guys certainly who could have warranted that number one spot. But for me, I just looked at it and I said, this guy, I mean, we've talked about it before. You just mentioned it, the Heisman race. I think Jeremiah Smith is going to go into the 2025 season as the biggest star in college football. I think he already was the biggest star in college football by the time the college football playoff was over, because of the fact that, Travis Henry had already completed his career. Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward and Dylan Gabriel and Ashton Jeanty, all of those guys had already completed their careers by the time you got to those last couple rounds of a college football playoff. There was no bigger star in those final two rounds of a college football playoff than Jeremiah Smith. And, it just speaks to how good, from day one, how good he was. And then, you think about all the hype he came into the season with, how good he was right away becoming an immediate star. And then in the biggest moment of the season, you need one play to go out and clinch a national championship. And Will Howard throws a deep bomb 56 yards to Jeremiah Smith. The trust that Ohio State had in him as a freshman, that in the biggest moment of the season, it turned to number 4. I think that moment right there speaks to how good this guy already was and is, and why, in my mind, even on a team full of stars, Jeremiah Smith was the best player for Ohio State in 2024.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the same can be said too of Caleb Downs on the other side of the ball. When you look at Ohio State's playoff run, I think a big storyline that I'm sure we'll dive into plenty this spring is that the offense and the defense really reached their full potential and really hit their stride when Chip Kelly and Ryan Day unlocked Jeremiah Smith, and when Jim Knowles and Matt Guerrieri unlocked Caleb Downs. Those two players becoming X factors is really what led to Ohio State becoming this unstoppable force on offense and this immovable object on defense. The way that they were able to manipulate the scheme to get Jeremiah Smith the football, or, for example, in the Texas game when they made him more of a decoy, allowed them to win those games and score points. On defense, allowing Caleb Downs to be this ball hawk, spy, a mixture of the pass defense and the run defense for him week in and week out against some of the top teams in the country is what allowed Ohio State to win the championship. So I think these two guys, we'll talk about where maybe there are some players on this list where they could go higher, they could go lower. These two players are appropriately ranked. And I think that maybe you could say Caleb Downs is 1, Smith is 2, but nevertheless, both of these guys are the top 2 guys on the roster.
Yeah, that's such a great point you made there about how you have those two guys, the way Ohio State built its offense and defense around them, and how that really propelled this team to a national championship. But I think you really saw that second half of the season after that Oregon game, the way they adjusted the defense. There were a lot of times Caleb Downs was playing like a middle linebacker, and Lathan Ransom, Jordan Hancock, two guys we'll talk about later, they had a lot to do with that too. How reliable they were on the back end allowed Ohio State to do more with Caleb Downs. But he just has such a well-rounded skill set. He can do so many things. You think about that defense again. That defense was so senior heavy, and yet the entire thing was built around a sophomore. That just shows you how good Caleb Downs is. And we both agreed. We both put Caleb Downs number 2 on our ballots. He did receive 2 first-place votes from our staff. The other guy who received 2 first-place votes from our staff was Jack Sawyer. And Jack Sawyer, a guy who had been ranked 8th at the end of a regular season, making a jump into the top 3 in the final rankings. And certainly that all starts with the 83-yard scoop and score that he had against Texas in the Cotton Bowl. One of the most iconic plays in Ohio State history, a play that won Ohio State a college football playoff semifinal game. And that right there made Jack Sawyer a legend. But it's not just because of that play that he's in the top 3. It's because of how dominant he was week in and week out throughout the college football playoff. And really from the start of November, he was a dominant player. We've talked about it each of the last 2 years. He was kind of Mr. November, December, and January of the second half of the season. He just seems to find a different gear. And then he found even another gear in the college football playoff. He had 7 pass breakups in the CFP. That was the most of any player in the CFP. He's a defensive end, and he had 7 pass breakups. Also had 4.5 sacks. Just really down the stretch of a season, even before the CFP, it just felt like Jack was the guy who was setting the tone up front for that defense, putting constant pressure on quarterbacks. Obviously, a guy who I think you could call the heart and soul of the 2024 Buckeyes, being from Ohio, how much he loved Ohio State, just the passion that he brought to the field. And I think that really showed in his play down the stretch as he became one of the superstars of his team.
Right. And the performance on the field for Jeremiah and for Caleb are what make them deserving of the number 1 and the number 2 spots. I also think, too, Jack Sawyer earning those 2 first place votes is extremely well deserved, not only for his performance on the field, but for what he accomplished off of it, as you're saying. He is the heart and soul of this team. He was the backbone of this team. He gets all the credit for bringing so many of these seniors back, for really galvanizing that class to return for this season. And then not only that, but it's not a moment that Ohio State fans like to talk about a lot, but Jack Sawyer was at the forefront of that post-game brawl or fight that occurred during the Ohio State-Michigan game or immediately after. And it kind of becomes this moment. There's pictures of him grasping a Michigan flag and throwing it, and him screaming that the Michigan team wasn't going to be able to plant the flag on this field. You could see the fire and the energy that shows in that moment. That it shows behind closed doors at the Woody during practice and during workouts and during meetings. And so for him to have that moment and not have it be the lasting legacy of him at Ohio State, to transform it into something greater, like the scoop and score or like the consistent performances that he put together in the college football playoff, is a testament to the kind of character that he has on and off the field and the type of performances and energy that he brings on it.
Speaking of guys who bring fire and energy and passion to the Ohio State football team, that certainly describes Will Howard as well. And Will Howard, another guy making a huge jump in our final Buckeye 20 rankings of the year, moving up into the number 4 spot. And I think, personally, I felt like Will Howard was underranked in our end of regular season rankings. He came in at number 12 in those rankings. I think the poor performance he had against Michigan weighed a lot into that, understandably. And I think he probably got a little more penalized than he should have been in those rankings just based on what had happened in his most recent game. But regardless of that, this guy took it to another level in the college football playoff. He completed 82 of 109 passes for 1,150 yards and 8 touchdowns with only 2 interceptions in the college football playoff. I think was really fantastic in all 4 of those CFP games. And really, the year as a whole, he completed a school record 73% of his passes for 4,010 yards and 35 touchdowns. Also ran for 226 yards and 7 touchdowns. I mean, you'll remember, Chase, we did one of these videos before the season, and I admitted I did not have Will Howard on my top 20 going into the season. I firmly will point the finger at myself as one of the people who doubted Will Howard in terms of, could he be an elite passer? Could he be that quarterback to lead Ohio State to a national championship? But he proved all of his doubters wrong with how well he played throughout the season, and especially in the college ball playoff. You're talking about a guy, the big question going into the year was his deep ball. He completed 57.4% of his passes beyond 20 yards this season. That was the best mark in the entire country. And then you combine that with just the exemplary leadership that he gave to this team all year long. I think Will Howard ended up being the perfect quarterback for this Ohio State football team. You could argue he was the best quarterback in the country with everything that he did this season, and certainly belongs very near the top of the list for Ohio State's best players in 2024.
Yeah, and he never really did. I don't want to say never, but he did things that were ordinary, and that allowed him to then be extraordinary. For him to develop the consistency, that taking what the defense gives you, completing the passes that the offense schemed up for him to throw, allowed him to develop the rhythm and the consistency that really set a fire underneath him for this college football playoff run. It kind of allowed him to, I guess, with Jeremiah Smith being someone that caught fire in the playoffs, that also allows Will Howard to catch fire, and vice versa. And his connection then with Emeka Egbuka and Carnell Tate and G. Scott, TreVeyon Henderson becoming a receiving threat out of the backfield. There wasn't, I guess, times where I thought Will Howard had to be Superman. There were a few, and when those opportunities came, he delivered in a big way. I think about the 4th-and-2 conversion in the Cotton Bowl against Texas. I know that he fell. I know that he tripped. I know that's been a big joke, but like, Ohio State doesn't convert that there. Do they win the football game? It's a fair question. Like, does Ohio State enter into the Rose Bowl, and is Will Howard not connecting on some of these throws? Like, do they beat Oregon in such a dominant fashion? You can say the same about Tennessee. Like, the way that he came out in each of these games was it's such a consistent effort to deliver the ball where it needed to be, on time and accurately. And then when those big moments came up, he delivered in a way that we haven't seen an Ohio State quarterback really have the chance to since that 2014 playoff run. The games mattered. They were big moments. CJ Stroud obviously had great moments as Ohio State's quarterback, Justin Fields too. But Will Howard just had something this season that when those big moments came up and Ohio State needed to have it, he delivered in every possible way. And it ended up working out in the long run for Ohio State winning that national title.
Emeka Egbuka rounding out our top 5 for Ohio State's best players of the 2024 season. Another fantastic year for Emeka Egbuka, becoming just the 2nd player in Ohio State history, joining his former Ohio State teammate Marvin Harrison Jr. to top 1,000 yards in 2 different seasons, as he caught 81 passes for 1,011 yards and 10 touchdowns in 2024. He also, in the process of helping Ohio State win a national championship against Notre Dame, became Ohio State's all-time leader in receptions. I think Emeka's a guy, you just look at the last 3 years, had that ankle injury in 2023 that slowed him down. But outside of that, you're just talking about a guy who's just been a model of consistency for Ohio State, who just shows up week in and week out, makes plays, is productive, never quite got that shine of being Ohio State's wide receiver 1 because he was with Marvin Harrison Jr. for 2 years, and then he was with Jeremiah Smith for a year. But a guy who I think was so crucial to Ohio State's success this season by just being that guy you knew you could always rely on to make plays in the intermediate passing game, to extend plays in the open field, a team captain for a reason, and a guy who I think firmly established himself among the many Ohio State wide receiver greats in recent years with an excellent senior season.
Yeah, and you need somebody like that on your team, especially in your wide receiver room. Someone with the humility to understand that he wasn't the wide receiver 1, and he didn't need to be the wide receiver 1 for this team to have success. With Marvin Harrison Jr. and with Jeremiah Smith, both of those guys took hold of that wide receiver 1 spot pretty firmly, pretty early on. Harrison in his first season, his sophomore season, then after the Rose Bowl performance, which he had 3 touchdowns. And then Jeremiah Smith comes in and scores, I think, twice in that season opener against Akron. So we could kind of see the writing on the wall that Emeka Egbuka might not be that number 1 guy this season for Ohio State, but at the same time, he was as valuable as he has ever been to be someone that Will Howard could consistently look to in the short to intermediate passing game. And a guy that you knew that when the ball was thrown his way, he was going to catch it is just as important as the guy who can break the defense open with the deep ball or who can make one-handed catches. You need someone who's reliable like Emeka Egbuka.
Speaking of guys who had fantastic seasons, but I think got overshadowed a little bit by the other star at their position, JT Tuimoloau. All the talk about Jack Sawyer, but JT Tuimoloau, he had one of the best seasons an Ohio State defensive ends ever had. He had 21 and a half tackles for loss, which is the 4th most in school history, 12 and a half sacks, which are the 5th most in school history in a single season. He became the first Ohio State defensive end ever to earn all Big Ten honors in 3 straight seasons. And he's another guy who was at his best in the CFP. In Ohio State's 4 CFP games, JT Tuimoloau had 23 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 2 pass breakups, and a forced fumble. And he suffered an ankle injury in the game against Texas, and he still had a fantastic game against Notre Dame in the national championship game, even though it was clear he was still bothered by that ankle injury. And so JT Tuimoloau, I don't know if he's gotten quite as much love as he's deserved over the last couple of weeks just because of all the well-deserved love that Jack Sawyer has gotten. But JT Tuimoloau, I mean, both of those guys, there was so much of a narrative for their Ohio State career of, can they finally get to that 5-star level? It was like, they're good players, but they're not quite that 5-star player that they were recruited to be. And in the CFP, both of those guys became exactly the 5-star players they were supposed to be, and cemented themselves well within the conversation alongside the Chase Youngs and Bosa's of the world as some of Ohio State's greatest recent defensive ends.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, Tuimoloau is always somebody that would show up in those first round mock drafts. And as someone that's covered the team or has been involved, like just seeing it from a closer perspective, it's always like, I don't really know if he's a first round pick right now. Like, I don't know if I've seen him play at that level. I know that PFF metrics would say that he was always generating pressures and that he was always winning his one-on-ones and stuff like that. But in terms of looking at the box score, maybe we were unfairly comparing him to some of the greats that came before him, like a Chase Young or the Bosa brothers. But I think we all wanted to see some more production in that regard. And seeing him go on this run in the CFP was kind of a validation to all of those projections that were set on him to be a first-round NFL draft pick. He is someone that definitely changed the game, not only by box score contributions, but just by the way that he was able to generate pressure and to disrupt the run game as well. Those tackles for loss, I mean, 21 and a half, that is incredible. For a season that was 16 games, you're talking about around 1 to 2 a game there. That's an impact play a game, and that's definitely something that NFL teams are going to love to have on their roster for years to come.
Donovan Jackson, another player who certainly moved up the rankings with his play in the college football playoff. He was ranked 14th on our end of regular season rankings. He jumps up to 7th, and that all owes to a phenomenal college football playoff run as Ohio State's left tackle. A guy who had never played tackle collegiately before moving there mid-season after Josh Simmons' season-ending injury, did not allow a single sack in the college football playoff. I mean, even just going back to the end of a regular season. I mean, you think about the run of pass rushers that he went against. You know, Mikhail Kamara from Indiana, Josiah Stewart from Michigan, James Pierce Jr. from Tennessee, Mateo Uyunglele and Jordan Birch from Oregon, Texas Colin Simmons from Texas. Notre Dame had some good defensive linemen as well. One week after another, Donovan Jackson just did his job on that left side of the offensive line. He saved Ohio State's season in many ways. If Donovan Jackson had not been able to make that move to left tackle as successfully as he did, we are probably not talking about Ohio State being a national championship team right now. And so he came in 7th on our balloting, but you could easily argue that he should be ranked higher. I think you would argue that, Chase, as you had him ranked 3rd on your ballot.
I did, yeah. And I wrote this in the school session, one of them after the national championship game. It featured some of those stats that you mentioned, that Donovan hadn't given up a sack in the playoffs. I think it was maybe either one pressure or one hurry that he had given up in the entire playoffs. And I think about the impact that he made this year. I know that the offensive line it's a very tough position room to grade, because when the offensive line holistically fails, I think it's very hard to say one player performed extremely well. Or when an offensive line performs well, it's even hard to say that one particular player was the reason for it. So it is judged as a unit more often than not. And so it was hard for me at the end of the regular season, seeing the way that Ohio State's offensive line performed against Michigan, to probably give Donovan Jackson the respect that he deserved for his performance moving to left tackle. But then when you see the impact that he made in the playoffs, it's clear, as you are saying, if he did not have the level of performance that he did against 4 consecutive top 10 ranked teams, I don't think that we're talking about Ohio State as national champions. The way that he was able to protect Will Howard, the way that he was able to road grade for TreVeyon Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, it's remarkable. And I think even we joked about this while we were in Atlanta, Dan. There could be NFL teams that want to draft him as a left tackle by the way that he performed in the playoffs. And they'll definitely love to have him be a guy that can swing between the two positions of left tackle and left guard. So I could speak for hours about the impact Donovan Jackson made. It was incredible to see him accomplish what he did this season.
TreVeyon Henderson comes in at 8th, which I think is a good exemplification of just how many stars this team had, because I look at it and go, how is TreVeyon Henderson only 8th? And then I look at my ballot and I go, oh yeah, I had him 8th on my ballot, because that just speaks to how many studs there were on this team, especially in the college football playoff, because TreVeyon Henderson was phenomenal. I think he was a guy. I mean, people have made the comparison here. They made the point that if you look at his first touchdown and his last touchdown of his Ohio State career, they were both 70-plus yard screen passes. And so you saw it from game one that TreVeyon Henderson was that dynamic home run hitter. I think the thing TreVeyon Henderson did this year is he really became a complete running back. He still made those dynamic home run plays, a lot of them, particularly that 75-yard touchdown against Texas in the Cotton Bowl. He averaged more than 7 yards per carry this season, which was the best among all running backs who played in the CFP. And so he continued to be that fantastic runner who could break off a big run at any time. But I think we saw him grow as a pass catcher, 27 passes for 284 yards receptions this year. And then I think the area you really saw TreVeyon Henderson grow this year was in pass blocking. You go back to that last play, the Jeremiah Smith play. You watch that play. TreVeyon Henderson makes a key block in the middle of the offensive line that gives Will Howard the time to make that deep throw. You saw that all season. TreVeyon Henderson just making terrific blocks out of the backfield. And I think when you combine that with the big plays that we saw from TreVeyon, he was truly one of the best running backs in college football this year.
Yeah, and I think you explained it perfectly. Him coming in as a home run hitter and evolving into a complete back it was one of my favorite arcs, I think, of an Ohio State player among that 2021 class. And I think that there was an unfair narrative around TreVeyon as well, that, to borrow from Carlos Lachlan, that he was a soft baked cookie, that he had an injury problem, right? It was his sophomore season that he had the torn ligaments in his foot. And then his junior season, he breaks a rib. And neither of those two injuries are ones that are for, they're not injuries that would have reflected on TreVeyon Henderson and the way that he takes care of his body. Those are two pretty fluke things. That's one where your foot just kind of gives out on you. And that's one where he got cracked by a linebacker in the Notre Dame game. And as we saw, Notre Dame has linebackers that play at a national championship level. So those two injuries are ones that I don't really think you can blame him for. But we saw that when he was healthy, he is one of the most dynamic players in the country. That every time he touches the ball, there's that home run threat. But also, he's able to pancake people whenever they rush up the middle. Like even in the Akron game at the start of this season, he had one of the most impressive blocks I've seen from a college running back. So him becoming a 3-down back, a complete back, was definitely one of my favorite things to see for this class in terms of the development that they had at Ohio State.
You look at these rankings as a whole, but how our voting played out, there was a pretty clear gap between the top 12 and then everyone else. Tyleik Williams coming in at number 9, Quinshon Judkins coming in at number 10, Cody Simon coming in at number 11, Lathan Ransom coming in at number 12. Starting with Tyleik, I mentioned that because neither of us had Tyleik in the top 10 on our ballots, yet he comes in number 9 based on a staff-wide poll. But again, like when I left him out of the top 10, he was one of those guys. It's like, man, like it's really hard to leave Tyleik Williams out of the top 10 on my ballot. There's just so many players who had great years on this team. And, Tyleik's a guy, he didn't put up quite the numbers this year that he did a year ago, but I think certainly, you watch the games every week, he was a guy who was creating a lot of disruption in the middle of the defense and was a huge reason why Ohio State ranked second in the country in yards allowed per carry.
Yeah, and it all works in tandem, right? Like Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau can't have the production that they have if Tyleik Williams has it. And, to see those defensive ends produce the way that they did down the stretch, I think is a testament to the way that Tyleik Williams and someone who will show up later on the Buckeye 20, Ty Hamilton, were able to set the tone on the interior. Those guys, while they didn't produce so much in the box scores, were players that were consistently causing disruption, especially in the run game, even if they weren't the ones making the tackles. Ohio State had one of the top ranked rush defenses in the country. And that starts with the interior defensive line. That starts with the linebackers.
Quinshon Judkins coming in at number 10. I think Quinshon was an interesting guy this year because, the first month of the season, there were times where I'm like, this guy might be the best player on the team. He really came out, was phenomenal in Ohio State's first few games. Then I think there were times in the regular season where it felt like he faded a bit, where, I think there were some questions about why is he getting more touches than TreVeyon Henderson, because TreVeyon was making more of those big plays. But when it came down to it at the end of the year, particularly in that national championship game, when they needed Quinshon Judkins to be at his best, he sure was, scoring 3 touchdowns, also having a 70-yard run in that game against Notre Dame. And I think, really just in tandem, I think in the end, that pairing of TreVeyon and Quinshon ended up being exactly what Ohio State thought it could be and needed it to be. They kept each other fresh. You mentioned the injuries before with TreVeyon. I think it really benefited both of those guys that they were splitting carries all year long, because when it came to the college football playoff, they were both fresh. They both played their best football of the season in the CFP because they hadn't been beat up, because they hadn't taken these really heavy workloads from being the featured back in the offense all year long. And I think that allowed both those guys to really peak at the right time. And I think, bringing in Quinshon, I think that really proved to be the perfect complement to TreVeyon Henderson in that Ohio State backfield.
Yeah, Quinshon Judkins, his first 2 years at Ole Miss, he had 274 carries, and then he had 271. His third season here at Ohio State, he had 194. So you're talking about almost 80 less carries a season for him, or 80 less carries than in his first 2 seasons. But he still made just as good of an impact. His first season at Ole Miss, he had almost 1,600 yards on the ground. His second season, he had around 1,158. This season, he had 1,060. He had 14 touchdowns, which is just about the same number as he had at Ole Miss in both seasons. He had 16 and 15. So even though he wasn't getting as many carries, he was just as much impacting the game by reaching the end zone. And that capped off, of course, with a 3-touchdown performance in the national championship game, which is the one that people will remember. When they look back on this national championship game, they'll think Quinshon Judkins had 3 touchdowns. And that was 2 on the ground, 2 pretty hard-fought carries on the ground, one where he stiff-armed someone straight into the turf, and then another where he caught one wide open in the end zone after a great play from Will Howard. So those 3 scores made him someone that I think we were kind of thinking he might be the offensive MVP. It ended up going to Howard, but Judkins definitely had a case for it. So that'll be his legacy here for this season, and that 3-touchdown championship game will be one that people will remember.
Now, Cody Simon's a guy for me, with all respect to all of our voters on the staff, he's the guy for me that when I look at these final rankings, I say, I think he should be a little higher. I personally had Cody Simon 5th on my ballot. I just think the evolution that he had as a player in his 5th-year senior season, he's a guy who I think coming out of last year, finished last year strong, but was always just kind of viewed as more of kind of a role player, maybe kind of that guy who's a, good football player, but kind of that limited ceiling, not going to ever be a star. And then this year he became a star. He became one of the best linebackers in the country. He had the block O for a reason, and I think he lived up to it. I think he was just that Mr. Reliable at that middle linebacker position, finished the year with 112 tackles, 12 and a half tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 7 pass breakups. And I think both those numbers really stand out to me because I think the 112 really shows you just how consistent he was. But those 12 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 7 pass breakups, those are the kind of plays we weren't seeing Cody Simon make early in his career. Those impact game-changing kind of plays that he proved he could make this year. And so, the fact that he's outside of a top 10 again, that just speaks to how much talent this team had, how many stars they had down the stretch, because I think Cody Simon had a phenomenal 2024 season.
Yeah, and I'll move on to the next guy within this spiel, I guess I'll call it. Lathan Ransom is somebody that I viewed as probably higher than other people did. I've always seen Lathan Ransom as someone who is one of the most valuable players on this defense. And I think one of the ways that you can test someone's value is you judge the defense, and you judge that by when he's on the field and when he's off the field. And I think you saw a noticeable difference last season, especially after Lathan Ransom got hurt in the Wisconsin game, between what Ohio State was able to do on defense with him on the field and with him off the field. And then this season, pairing him next to the number 2 player on our list, Caleb Downs, he is someone that the way that those two players worked together, it was clear to me, probably along with Notre Dame, that those two units, I would pick Ohio State though, that they were the best safety duo in the country. And Lathan Ransom, I think for most of the year, was the number 1 graded rush defender by PFF. And that's regardless of position. That's defensive line, that's linebacker, that's defensive back. The way that Lathan Ransom shoots down into the gap like a missile is unique only to him. He is someone that lays the boom each and every time he delivers a hit. And I think that him, along with Caleb Downs, along with those 2 linebackers, Cody Simon at the forefront, were guys that made impact at all 3 levels of the field. And I was very surprised, maybe as you were, with Cody Simon falling in outside of the top 10. I was surprised that Lathan Ransom fell outside of the top 10, because I think he's somebody that makes an impact play every time he's on the field.
Yeah, it's very interesting with Lathan because he came in 4th at the end of a regular season, finished 12th at the end of the season, and I don't think he did anything wrong in the college football playoff to preempt that kind of drop. I think it's just a matter of there were so many other guys who were fantastic in the college football playoff that he ended up getting jumped in those final rankings. And, I know for me, and I think for most of us, we don't necessarily look at it like when we're making our rankings, we're not looking at it as like, oh, who do we move up or move down from the past rankings? We kind of start from scratch every time. And so that can lead to somebody moving down through no fault of their own, just because of, TreVeyon Henderson would be another guy. Like, he moved down. He was fantastic in the CFP. Cody Simon moved down. He was fantastic in the CFP. They didn't drop through any fault of their own. It's just there were so many guys like Jack Sawyer, like Will Howard, like JT Tuimoloau, like Donovan Jackson, who were so good in the CFP that they had to move up from where they were before. And so I think certainly Cody Simon, Lathan Ransom, you put them on pretty much any other team in the country, I don't think you'd be talking about them being the 11th and 12th best players this past season, because they were both fantastic. Moving on to the rest of the list, Seth McLaughlin coming in at 13. As I mentioned, a pretty big gap in the voting from the top 12 to where Seth McLaughlin is at 13. And I think you couldn't put Seth in that real top group of guys because of the fact that he didn't play in the college football playoff. But you're talking about a guy who was the best center in college football this season before that injury, winning the Remington Trophy. And so that's why, even though he missed the final 6 games of the season, Seth McLaughlin still comes in at 13 because, boy, before that injury, he was phenomenal.
Yeah, I think like Will Howard, like Jack Sawyer, he's someone that I really love to see off the field, and the way that he interacted with the guys, the leadership that he had. I was going back recently, I was doing some stuff for the school session on the offensive line, and I'm looking back to the way that guys like Carson Hinsman and Tegra Shabola and Josh Fryer would talk about Seth McLaughlin and the knowledge that he came with from Alabama, bringing it to Ohio State. This was back in the spring. It was something that they were very impressed with, how smart he is and how he's able to translate his wisdom to Ohio State's players, how he was able to in a way that was digestible and in a way that was easy to understand, is something that I think really helped this offensive line take a leap this season. And also, too, you have the moments where he's like smoking a cigar on the sideline against Tennessee, or he's riding around the scooter in the national championship game screaming his lungs out. Like those kind of moments, I think were really impactful for this team, even if it didn't come on the field.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. You think two guys who, as good as they were in their Ohio State career, Seth McLaughlin and JT Barrett, and yet for both of them, some of the indelible images of their Ohio State career are going to be them riding around on a scooter during the
Yeah.
college football playoff because of the injuries that they had. But I that is something. We'll get to Josh Simmons in a few minutes. That's something that I factored in though when I thought about where to rank Seth McLaughlin. Is Josh Simmons, I don't hold it against him. He was just doing what was best for him. But, he suffered his injury. He moved on from a team. He went off to go rehab and focus on the NFL draft. Seth McLaughlin never left the team after that. I mean, literally like the next day at practice after tearing his Achilles, he was out there coaching up guys on the field. And that's something I factored in when I thought about where to rank Seth. It's like, you can't put him in that real top group because of the fact that he didn't actually play in the college football playoff when the most important games of a season. But I don't want to penalize him for his season getting cut short because he was so good before that injury. And then he continued to do everything he could after suffering that injury to still try to help that team win a national championship. Next guy on the list, Jordan Hancock, coming in at number 14. And I think Jordan Hancock's another one of those guys who was kind of an unsung hero for this Ohio State football team. Never got the headlines necessarily for being one of the stars of his team. But you talked about at the top of the show about Caleb Downs and how they were able to build the defense around him and how they were able to move him into a different role as the season progressed. That might not have been possible if not for Jordan Hancock, because what Ohio State was able to do in the second half of the season was really turn Jordan Hancock into a hybrid cornerback, hybrid safety, where sometimes he's playing slot corner, sometimes he's playing free safety. And that allowed them to run a lot of different kinds of coverage, to run a lot of different alignments defensively within their base defense without having to sub out of a base defense because of Jordan Hancock's ability to move between different spots without missing a beat. So I think Jordan Hancock's one of those guys who maybe doesn't get as much attention as some of the other stars on his team, but played an integral role in Ohio State having the best defense in the country this year.
Yeah, and Jordan Hancock is a testament to when people talk about defensive backs, um, to have nothing to say almost is a good thing. For them not to be noticeable is a good thing. And I don't think that there were times, as you're saying, that Jordan Hancock really made the headlines, but that was just because he went to work every day and he did a good job. He was somebody that I think was so dependable and so reliable. And as you're saying, when they were allowing Caleb Downs to kind of roam in the middle of the field, that put a lot of responsibility on Lathan Ransom and Jordan Hancock to take care of sort of the opposite thirds on the sidelines, to let Caleb Downs hang there in the middle and kind of be middle linebacker a few steps back from where Cody Simon was lined up. You had to trust that Jordan Hancock and Lathan Ransom were going to do their jobs. And more often than not, they did their jobs. And I think that's a testament to the way that he played this season.
We've talked about a lot of guys here who aren't going to be on the Ohio State football team next season. One who will is Sonny Styles, who comes in at number 15 in our rankings. And I think Sonny's a guy who just got better and better as the year progressed, which you would expect from a guy who was playing a new position, moving from safety to linebacker. There were some hiccups along the way. There were times where I think you could see that Sonny was still learning how to play a new position. But in the end, finished the year of 100 tackles, made a lot of impact plays, 10.5 tackles for loss, 6 sacks, 5 pass breakups. And I think, he's a guy, when we're doing this going into next season, there's a good chance we're going to be talking about him as a potential, top 5 player on that 2025 football team. And it's going to be interesting to see, can he make that leap now from being a really good player to being a star player for the Buckeyes, because they're going to need him to be with all these defensive stars if they're losing.
Yeah, and Sonny Styles was someone that came into the season and you could automatically see the trust that Jim Knowles and the defensive coaches had in him. Because Cody Simon, it's hard for me to remember this sometimes, but he missed a couple games at the start of the year. And when he missed those games, Sonny Styles was the guy that was wearing the green dot. He was the one that was communicating the play calls to the defense. And he's a guy, also something that many people, including me, forget. Sonny Styles came into college a year early. So this is a guy that it's his junior season, but he's barely turning 21. He's a guy that he's not, I guess, the typical age, the typical uh, development that a guy who's in his third season would be. But Sonny Styles, being someone who is mature beyond his years and being someone who is physically developed beyond his years, is someone that was able to make a transition from safety to linebacker and thrive toward the end of the season. I had my doubts and I had my questions early on in the year. I remember specifically after the Michigan State game, asking myself and writing in the Skull session, like, is Sonny Styles going to be able to do this? Like, was this too much too quickly for him? And after that game, really after the Iowa game, one that allowed him to just run downhill and slam into Caleb Johnson a ton of times, I think I saw a development each and every week, an evolution of the way that he was used in this defense and the way that he was able to make an impact. I think his game against Texas is what I'm going to remember. He had 3 tackles for loss. He had a sack in that game too. Like, that's a big time performance for someone that's a first year linebacker playing against one of the best teams in the country.
You mentioned with defensive backs, it's often a good thing when they are not talked about, but I think that kind of went both ways for Denzel Burke in terms of how his 2024 season was perceived, because I think for so many people, the indelible image of his season was that regular season game against Oregon, which was a bad game. We've talked about that ad nauseum. We don't need to rehash anymore about that one game. But I think it was a little bit unfair the way Denzel Burke's season got depicted, because if you look at the rest of his games that he had this year, he did not allow more than 4 catches or 36 yards in any of Ohio State's ever 15 games, if you go off of Pro Football Focus's numbers. And, certainly he didn't live up all the way to the expectations that he came into the season with. I mean, I had him ranked number 1 going into the season. He was not that. But I still think Denzel Burke, on the whole, had a very good year. I think he was what Ohio State needed him to be, is that number 1 cornerback. That's why a big reason why they had the number 1 pass defense in the country, is because they had really good cornerback play. And so I don't know if Denzel Burke's senior season will be remembered as fondly as some of these other seniors who we've talked about before will be. But I think he's a guy, I don't necessarily dispute him being ranked 16th just because there were so many great players on this team. But I do think that Denzel Burke deserves a lot of credit for how he played in the 15 other games, rather than all the focus being on that one bad game he had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's someone that I credit with helping bring BIA back. I think that was one of his major goals in his 4 years here at Ohio State. When he entered in, he was starting opposite Cam Brown. His second season, he started opposite Cam Brown. But then coming in with Davison Igbinosun as a junior, and then finishing out his senior season opposite of IGB again, those 2 guys, they delivered on what they wanted to accomplish by creating one of the top pass defenses in college football. It really helped in the playoffs that the pressure was getting home as consistently as it was. And it really helped that Caleb Downs was able to fulfill the role that we've talked about now in a couple of different spots on this show. But Denzel Burke is someone that I saw, especially down the stretch, deliver when it mattered. As you're saying, 4 catches, 36 yards being the maximum that he allowed outside of that Oregon game is impressive. And it's something that, as I think you're saying correctly, we might not talk about it as much as we probably should here in the years to come about this national championship team. He definitely played an integral role in capturing the championship.
You mentioned Josh Simmons at the top of a show. He comes in at 17th on the Buckeye 20. Now, I was with you. I didn't have Josh Simmons on my ballot And, my personal opinion on that was he just didn't play enough games. He only played in 6 games. As mentioned, that was the end of his season, and then he moved on from the team. Now, I don't necessarily dispute, where he comes in here based on our staff-wide balloting, because, you could make a case before that injury. He was the best left tackle in the country. He had not allowed a single sack. He had been dominant at left tackle. But in my personal opinion, if it had been just me making these rankings, I wouldn't have put him in the top 20 solely because of the fact that he played in fewer than half the games, and those most important games of the season, he was not able to be out there for them.
Yeah, I had 19 guys down on my list, and I was stuck on 20 for a while, and still Josh Simmons didn't really come to mind. And that's nothing against him as a player. I think while he played this season, he was excellent. And I think that NFL teams are going to value him very highly in the draft in April. But yeah, for some reason, he just wasn't somebody, maybe because of the timing of his injury, or maybe as you were saying, that he wasn't on the sidelines when Ohio State hoisted the championship trophy. He just wasn't someone that I remember. We talked a lot about his loss, or the impact of his loss. But I just think that in terms of the way his lasting legacy will be for this team this season, it will be kind of a cliff note. It'll be kind of something that is a part of the season and a part of the story, but individually, his impact may be forgotten in the grand scheme of things.
And yet it's interesting because, as you mentioned before, there's a real chance he's going to be the first player drafted from this team in
Right.
April. There's going to be a lot of, first, second, third round picks from his team. He might be the first one off the board because that's how highly he's regarded as a left tackle. So certainly, had he been able to play the entire season, I think he probably would have been very high on this list, ultimately coming in at 17 because his season was shortened. I was right there with you, Chase. For me, there were 19 guys that I felt strongly about putting on the list, and then that 20th one was tough. The 3 other guys that I think for both of us were in that 19 that we haven't yet talked about are the guys who came in 18th, 19th, and 20th on the list, those being Ty Hamilton at 18, Carnell Tate at 19, Davison Igbinosun at 20. And I think, these are 3 other guys who maybe aren't thought of as the stars of his team, but all played very important roles. Ty Hamilton, a guy who I think was rock solid all year long. I mean, if you don't have a good nose tackle, you don't have one of the best run defenses in the country. And so Ty Hamilton played a big role in that from his nose tackle spot, recording 51 tackles. I think much like his older brother Devon, finishing his career with his best season as a Buckeye.
Yeah, as you said, like this defense, the way they were able to defend the run is a testament to how him and Tyleik Williams played in the middle. And that also too, like I always used to think this with Teron Vincent. Like Teron Vincent was always talked about as someone that would eat up double teams. Like Ty Hamilton and Tyleik Williams demanded so much attention from the offensive line that it allowed Cody Simon and Sonny Styles to be the kind of run defenders that they were. And even if the offensive line then got past Vince, or bringing up Teron Vincent again, even if they were able to get off of Hamilton and get off of Williams up to the next level, that's what then allowed Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom to be the kind of run defenders that they were. So it all starts at that first level. The kind of impact that Hamilton and Williams were able to make kind of is that domino effect. They're able to impact the game in more ways than just a box score.
Carnell Tate, a guy, he was the number 3 receiver at Ohio State, but he'd certainly be the number 1 or number 2 receiver just about everywhere else. And, maybe that's one of the reasons why there was some talk last week about teams trying to get him to enter the transfer portal and transfer elsewhere. But he still had plenty of production at Ohio State. 52 catches for 733 yards and 4 touchdowns this past season. And again, as one of just a small group of guys on this list who are going to be back at Ohio State next season, he's certainly a guy that I think gave you a lot of reason to believe going into 2025 that he can really take that next step and become an elite player in 2025.
Yeah, and we talked about this while Carnell was reportedly exploring his transfer portal options. Really, that whole dialogue just kind of seemed to me a conversation about what Carnell Tate is worth, what he's worth to Ohio State, what he thinks he is worth as an individual. But all the while, I think you and I and a lot of other of our staffers were kind of scratching our heads like, he'll be the second wide receiver next year, but the second wide receiver for Ohio State of the past 3 years just broke the all-time receptions record. Like, there are not very many programs in the country. There might only be just one in Ohio State where being a wide receiver 2 is just as good as being a wide receiver 1 anywhere across college football. So I think for him to step up into that role next year, now coming off of 2 back-to-back years where he grew in terms of his production and also in terms of his impact on the field, I think you're going to see a big season out of Carnell Tate. And I think that you'll only see him continue to grow in his role within the offense.
And then finally, rounding out the end-of-year Buckeye 20 is Davison Igbinosun, and I think it's pretty clear why Davison Igbinosun comes in the final spot on this list, and that's because of penalties. He had 16 penalties this year, which were 5 more than any other defender in the entire FBS. I think you take out those penalties, I think you've got a case for Davison to be significantly higher on this list because he had a really good year in coverage. He allowed just 32 catches for 368 yards and 2 touchdowns on 60 targets. I think he's also one of the best run defenders in the country from the cornerback position. So a guy who's a really good player, and I think we were both in the same boat. Yeah, I think we both put him in that 19 spot on our ballot of, he's a really good player, was another big part, much like Denzel Burke and Jordan Hancock and Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs, of that BIA secondary that Ohio State had. But the penalties are the one thing that you have to downgrade him on. And as the fifth of 5 guys on this list who are coming back for 2025, you think about what he needs to work on this offseason. I would imagine that to-do list is number 1, penalties, number 2, penalties, number 3, penalties. Because if he can cut that out of his game, if he can get better about not being overly handsy and about avoiding those penalties, he can absolutely be one of the best cornerbacks in college football in 2025.
Yeah, I think 2 things. We talked about, or the coaches talked about, him wearing oven mitts in practice. Put on the oven mitts all spring. Or, I was a basketball guy growing up. We always do a thing. You'd put a T-shirt around your neck. You'd hold it up here. That way you wouldn't reach in. You wouldn't get any reach-in fouls. You're playing defense like that. Maybe we do that. Let's just find a way to get Davison Igbinosun from committing holding and committing pass interference penalties, and his stock would increase tremendously. I have wondered, Dan, I don't know if Ohio State doesn't explore putting Davison in a role where he becomes more versatile than just being an outside corner next year. With Jordan Hancock leaving and the safety depth not being maybe exactly where Ohio State wants it to be heading into 2025, do we see opportunities where Davison moves into a nickel safety spot to allow guys like Jermaine Matthews and Aaron Scott, and I know that people are really high on Devin Sanchez coming in as a freshman, some of those younger guys to be at the corner while still keeping Davison on the field and allowing him to thrive in a more middle of the field role where he's off ball. He's not necessarily going to have enough time to grab onto a receiver or a tight end at the line of scrimmage, but also could he be closer to the line of scrimmage where he can impact the run game as well, because that's a place where he has thrived in his career as well. And I think that that's something that I'm curious heading into this next season where he might be able to make an impact in multiple ways just outside of defending wide receivers.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea. Certainly one that I'm sure we'll be talking about more over the next 7 months here as we prepare for the 2025 season. As we throw up the final rankings here on the screen one more time, we'll mention the other players who received votes from our staff in the final balloting. Josh Fryer, Caden Curry, Carson Hinsman, Jermaine Matthews Jr., and G. Scott Jr. I personally had G. Scott in the number 20 spot on my ballot because I felt like he really took a big step forward with some of the plays that he made in the CFP. Chase, I know that you had Josh Fryer in that number 20 spot. I think, those guys, there's even other guys you could mention, whether it's, Tegra Shabola starting at right guard all year, Kenyatta Jackson Jr., I think, giving him some good plays off the bench, Arvell Reese, Brandon Ennis. I don't think there's anybody who was a true snub here, because I think it was pretty clear, I'm pretty sure the top 20 were the same in different orders in every Buckeye 20 we did this year. So I think there was a pretty clear, these are the 20 best players on the team, but certainly lots of other guys who also contributed to this national championship run, many of whom are going to be stepping into much bigger roles in 2025.
Yeah, I had Josh Fryer in that 20 spot, really just because I feel like last season he was someone that was picked on a lot by fans, both Ohio State fans and non-Ohio State fans, for his performance, particularly in big games. And I feel like this season, much like Jordan Hancock, much like Denzel Burke at different parts of the year, you didn't really talk about Josh Fryer because maybe that's because there was so much other uncertainty on the offensive line, but he is somebody that played through injuries. He was somebody that played tough. He was somebody that really was consistent week in and week out. And yeah, he had his moments, but every offensive lineman did this season. I think that the way that he was able to step up and kind of bounce back this year with more familiarity and more comfortability at that right tackle spot impressed me.
Well, we hope you all enjoyed listening in on our final Buckeye 20 show of the year. We appreciate you following along with the countdown and with all of our coverage at 11 Warriors over the course of the 2024 national championship season. Much more to come over on 11warriors.com as we continue to look back on a legendary season for the Buckeyes and start to look ahead to the 2025 campaign. So for Chase Brown, I'm Dan Hope. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.